Sorry, I'm having slight problems with my PowerPoint. I've set it up, but it seems to have got a mind of its own now, and it changes from one slide to another without me doing anything. So I may have to manage without the slides, and we'll just trust to paper, I think, and holding up sheets in front of you. So you may think, what a weird title, the 7 Holy Convocations. You might know it better as the 7 Feasts of Israel, or the 7 Festivals of Israel. If you read in the Bible, God says that these are holy convocations. Now, we're pretty good on what holy is. That means it's to do with God, and we're getting righteous, and we're pure. We want to come to Him in purity. God is holy. He wants us to be holy. What is a convocation? Well, if you know your Latin, it's easy. Con means together, and the voc bit means calling. So it's a calling together. It's when God calls His people together. Now, we're talking here about Israel, but as we discovered last week, there are loads of things in the Old Testament which are pictures for the future. They are normally called shadows. The shadow is not the real thing, it's just an indicator. A shadow often looks the right shape, but it's not the actual thing. And we're going to look at some of these. Other things, you may have heard the word types. Types are normally characters or places which symbolise something to come in the future. Now I'm going to try, dare I do this, I'm going to try and get a slide up. No, that's the wrong slide, so ignore that for the moment. It might change to the right one. Just to go back to last week. Oh, hang on. Something coming? No. Just to go back to last week, I forgot to say at the end that actually Joshua is the same as Yeshua. Right, very quickly we'll jump in. It says here, don't let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. Right, I'm going to have to switch off that for the moment. Sorry about this, it just changes at its own speed and I can't work out how to change it. Technological problem or technological inefficiency by me. So, names in the Old Testament are sometimes written in slightly different forms, like Joshua, which is actually Joshua, and it can be written as Yeshua or Jeshua. And Yeshua, of course, is the name that Jesus was given. Remember, Mary was told to call him Yeshua, which translates eventually into English as Jesus. I won't go through that for the moment. So I'm just a bit like the icing on the cake, isn't it? The name Joshua is the same as Yeshua. So this high priest who was acting out something that was to come in the future actually even had the same name as the true high priest. So there you go, that was just an add-on. And for the previous week, I wonder if anyone decided to go through the other letters, the letters from the apostles, and to look at the greetings there. They're quite interesting, well worth doing if you want to do it. Okay, let's move on to the 7 Holy Convocations. Now, if I take a chance, it should come on after this one in a moment. Some of you will be very familiar with them. There are perhaps not some of those that you know of. I wonder which. There we go. They're the first 4. Pesach or Pesach, which Passover. Oh, I see we lost it now. I'll go back to the camera and sound and hold it up for you. There we go. Let's do it this way, the old-fashioned way. Here are the 7 feasts. At least the first 3 spring feasts. Now, it was after the giving of the 10 Commandments that God spoke to Moses, and he said, you should come together to meet with me 7 times in the year. Now, 3 of those times were all in 1 week at the beginning of the year, and he said, this month for you, when we're going to do this, is going to be the first month of the year. You may know it as Nisan, but actually God never gave names to the months or to the days of the week. He just called them first, second, third, and so on. So the first one is Pesach, which we know as Passover. The second one is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Chakamotzi. And the third one is the Feast of First Fruits, Yom HaBikurim. You will find different spellings in the Hebrew, by the way, but that's roughly right. So notice that Pesach, if you're making notes, copy this down quickly before it drops down. Pesach is the 15th day of the first month. Now the 15th day then is the beginning of the 3rd week. May not be the same day of the week every year because of the way the calendar works. The calendar is what's called a lunar calendar, which means that it's based on the moon. Ours is solar, it's based on the sun and our orbiting the sun. The lunar calendar is based on the cycle of the moon, which is roughly 28 days, 28 and a bit. So what they did, they had 28 days in some months and 29 in others. And there would be some slippage, and every now and again they had to put in an extra month to bring it back to how it should be. If you total up the number of days in the year, it's 360 by the lunar cycle. And each month begins when they first see the little crescent of the new moon. And that determines a new month. So this one, we're talking about the 15th day, so we are now into full moon as it happens. And as I started to read earlier, you shouldn't judge anyone about new moon festivals. So let's go and let's talk about them. Passover, I expect you're very familiar with. Passover takes you back to the time when the Israelites were set free from their slavery in Egypt, and you probably remember there were 10 plagues which God sent, and they were pretty awful. And it came to total darkness was the 9th one, and still Pharaoh didn't give in. The Egyptians found themselves in total darkness for 3 days and 3 nights, but meanwhile, where the Israelites lived, they were in light at day and darkness by night as normal. So there was something strange there, unrelated to the sun. Now, Pharaoh still didn't give in, wouldn't let them go. So one more plague came, and that was the killing of the firstborn, that's of people and livestock. And you'll remember probably that Moses told the Israelites they had to kill a lamb and take the blood and take a branch of hyssop, which is really their equivalent of a paintbrush, and take the blood and wipe it on the doorpost and lintel. And that way they would be saved. And that lamb that was slain at that time was known as the Passover lamb. Each family had to do it, each household, or maybe 2 households together if they weren't very large. Then the angel of death came, and sure enough, the firstborn of the whole of the Egyptians were slaughtered. But the angel of death passed over the Jewish place, the Israeli homes. Now, after that, God said that they were to keep this as a memorial. You remember they managed to escape then, and there's a story of crossing the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds, whichever you prefer to call it, and the miracle of them crossing the sea and then Pharaoh's army drowning in the sea. We often think these things all took place in one day. You've got to remember there was like 500,000 Israelites crossing, and quite a lot of chariots coming from the other side. So maybe it took place over several days. Now, God then said later on, around when they're in Sinai, he said to keep this as a memorial. You've got to remember this. Remember how I saved you out of Israel. And the key to this was the Passover lamb. It was the blood that showed that they shouldn't be killed. So they had to, every year, there would be a celebration on the 15th of the first month. As I say, it's often called Nisan now. And they had to eat a certain meal. It would be the lamb and a few herbs and spices. And they would celebrate. And they had to teach their children what happened at every time. So that's the feast of Passover. And the key to it really is the sacrificial lamb, which becomes identified with the forgiveness of sins later on, because, we'll see that later. The next one was Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, it's a strange one, actually, because the Feast of Unleavened Bread lasts for the whole week, and it starts the same day as Passover. And very quickly, Passover and unleavened bread, they got sort of like mixed up, became one. And so the Feast of Unleavened Bread is often called Passover, and it's like Passover lasts the whole week. Although Passover officially really is just one day. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread is to remind them that when they left Egypt, they didn't have time to make proper bread using yeast. And so they just rushed off with the ingredients, no yeast, and they had to make what is called unleavened bread. It just means it hasn't got any yeast in it, so it doesn't rise. And if you're not familiar with it, then you can buy matzos in Tesco's even, and they are unleavened bread. They had to eat this for a week to remind them of their escape from Egypt, that it was in a hurry, but it was God who did it. So that is the reminder. As I say, it's often the whole week is called Passover, and there's not much reference to the Feast of Unleavened Bread these days. So that was that feast. The third one, if I can just get this right, there we go. Feast of First Fruits. Now, it says day after the Sabbath. Now, all these holidays or feast days or convocations, these are all special days. They are special Sabbaths. Now, the Sabbath is on what we would know as Saturday. It's the seventh day of the week. But there are also special Sabbaths, and the Passover is one of them. Now, as I said, the Passover comes on different days in different years. So let's say, for example, Passover might be on, we'll call it Tuesday, which is the third day of the week. So that is a special Sabbath. Then, during the week of unleavened bread, there's another Sabbath coming up. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, 4 days later. And then the day after that Sabbath, it's a bit complicated maybe, the day after that Sabbath, that normal Sabbath, that is called the Feast of First Fruits. And that is when they would wave, I'm trying to remember what they waved then, I think it was the barley harvest. Now, the first fruits of the barley harvest. Now, the interesting thing is that it would change from year to year. So it's quite possible that, say, the 15th was, say, what we would call Friday. Then the very next day will be a Sabbath. So you'd have the high Sabbath or special Sabbath of Passover, followed by the normal Sabbath, followed by the Feast of First Fruits. The first fruits, of course, is always it's the first of the crop, and it's a promise of what is to come. Now, the fourth one, there we go. this is Shavuot, and you may have heard of that. It's called the Feast of Weeks, and it's 49 days after the Feast of First Fruits. That means it's 50 days after that Sabbath I just told you about. And that's why it's got two names, if you like. It's the Feast of Weeks, and it's Pentecost. Pentecost means it's 50 days. 50 days from the Sabbath, but it's 49 days from the day after the Sabbath, the Feast of First Fruits. Why is it called the Feast of Weeks? Well, I reckon it's fairly obvious, because a week in Israeli time, or in God's time, a week can mean 7 days, it can mean 7 years, or it can simply mean 7. So 49 days is a week of weeks. Yes, 7 sevens. So it's a week of weeks, which means it's the Feast of Weeks. Quite simple to understand, really. But it's quite commonly known also as Pentecost. And it's interesting that both instructions are given. The 49 days and the 50 days are both given by God in, I think it's in Leviticus. Now, there are two main passages where you can read about this thing. The main one is Leviticus chapter 23. I'm not going to open it up now because there's a lot in there. It's a lot of detail, and you need to do that in your own time. Leviticus chapter 23. Also, there's a briefer version in Deuteronomy chapter 16, and you'll get quite a long detailed one of the Passover, celebrating that in Exodus chapter 12. Now, I want to talk about these things. These are a shadow, and we're going to look at all four of these and see what they are a shadow of. Well, not surprisingly, just like Joshua and the chaps with him, and what we looked at last week, not surprising, these are a shadow of the Messiah, who we know as Jesus. So, Jesus, you've probably heard of this, Jesus is often known as the Passover Lamb, or Paschal Lamb. We'll stick with the Passover Lamb, because Paschal is associated with Easter, which is something else. We're talking about Jewish history here, or Israeli history. Jesus was the Passover Lamb. Now, we need to understand that if Jesus died on what is called Good Friday now, and he rose on Sunday, that doesn't make 3 days and 3 nights. And that's what got me really looking into all this stuff. I thought, that's not 3 days and 3 nights. He said, just as Jonah was in the belly of the big fish for 3 days and 3 nights. He didn't just say 3 days, he said 3 days and 3 nights. So that means that Jesus was not crucified on what we call Good Friday, the day before the Sabbath. Now, the reason for believing that is that when they took Jesus down from the cross, they wanted to get him down. The Jews said, can you take him down quickly, because we have the feast coming up, and we don't want him hanging there during the Feast of Passover. And so he was taken down from the cross. If you read in Luke, you'll find that it says, I think it's Luke, possibly one of the other Gospels, you find it says it was the day of preparation. So Jesus was not killed on Passover. Jesus was killed on the day of preparation, which is the day before the Passover. But what about the meal he had with his disciples? Wasn't that Passover? Well, if he was killed on the day before Passover, the day of preparation, he must have had his meal the evening before. So was it a Passover meal? Well, without going into too much detail, there is a way of explaining this, which is quite acceptable, really. and that is to do with the Essenes, who were responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because the Essenes apparently celebrated the Passover the day before everybody else. I don't know why. Also, it was normal for a water jar to be carried on the head by a woman. And Jesus said, when you see a man with a water jar, go and ask him to prepare our meal. So it's most likely that when they went and had their supper, the Last Supper is called, it was actually in the Essene household, which was already set up for the supper. And it is understood that a couple of Jesus' disciples may well have been Essenes themselves, and so they'd be familiar with this. So, there we go. What is the day of preparation? Well, the day of preparation is when the lambs are brought in for sacrifice, and it takes all day. But before that, out of interest, before that, the lambs have to be in Jerusalem for 4 days, and have to be inspected for 4 days, and to be seen to be pure. Jesus, well, you know what's coming, don't you? Jesus was seen in Jerusalem, in around the temple courts, for 4 days, leading up to the day when the lambs were slaughtered, ready for the Passover meal. You've got to remember, of course, which is complicated, the day begins at about 6 p.m. and finishes at 6 p.m. the following day, so it starts with the evening. Remember in Genesis 1 it says there's evening and morning, the first day. Not morning and evening as we tend to think, it was evening and morning. So, following their meal, which was in the evening of the day of preparation, Jesus was arrested, he was tried, he was crucified. Now, he was crucified in the daytime. Was it 12 o'clock our time? At the same time as the lambs were being slaughtered as a sacrifice for Passover. When Jesus died, he said, or just before he died, he cried out, "It's finished." And apparently that is what the high priest would call out when the last of the lambs was slaughtered. It is finished. And so we see this amazing fulfillment of the feast of Passover, that Jesus actually died at the same time as the lambs were being slaughtered. Of course, it wasn't on Good Friday. We're going to leave. I'm going to leave the detail because it's quite complicated. I have got a visual aid, but I think it's too small to see, so we'll just talk it through. So he was crucified, he was buried, and then 3 days later, on the what we call Sunday, the first day of the week, he was found to have risen, and he was 3 days and 3 nights. Let's move on now then to Shavuot, which is the Feast of Weeks. That's the one that's 49 days later. Oh, I've forgotten to say something. Wow. When Jesus rose from the dead, he rose on which day? He rose the day after the Sabbath. Remember, it says on the first day of the week, Mary went to the tomb. The day after the Sabbath. What was the day after the Sabbath? The Feast of First Fruits. And so Jesus is the first fruits of what? First fruits of the resurrection. He was the first one to be resurrected, and if you read some of Paul's letters, you'll find he refers to this. He actually calls Jesus the first fruits of the resurrection. So it's the promise of what is to come, and we look forward with great excitement, anticipation to that day when we have resurrection bodies as well. So let's move. Sorry, I nearly forgot that. Most important. So let's move on to the 49 days later, which is Shavuot. Now, there were 3 times in the year when the adult males had to go to Jerusalem for the Holy Convocation, or shall I call it the feast. Now the three feasts they had to go for were Passover, Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost, and then the last one, which I haven't told you about, not yet, but most of you, I expect, will know which one it was. So, that means that at Passover, there would have been a lot of people in Jerusalem, and certainly in the temple courts it would have been absolutely buzzing. The same would be true at Pentecost. Now, since the Jews had been dispersed many, many years ago with the exile, many of them still lived a long way away. And so they would journey in from areas round about and further, if they could make it, and they would come to Jerusalem. And so you would have in Jerusalem thousands and thousands of people. I'm not sure how many, it could have been as many as 1 million, who were in Jerusalem at that time, cramming the temple courts as much as they could. And they spoke the language of the country they come from. They may not have known Hebrew, because they would have been brought up in this foreign country. And so they spoke different languages. Now, of course, you know what's coming, don't you? You know the story. That it was Pentecost. Now, what does Pentecost celebrate? It's not clear in the Old Testament. God didn't make it very clear what Pentecost was, apart from celebrating the wheat harvest. And normally there's something more in it. And the rabbis calculated over the years that the law was given on this day. Now, don't ask me how they did it, I don't know. But certainly Jews today believe definitely that on the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost, that is when the law was given, and that's what they celebrate. And you may have seen pictures of them carrying the Torah in the scrolls in the great big cylindrical containers. They parade them around the streets with great joy. They love the Torah. It's almost like they worship it more than God. So it's a celebration of giving the law. Now, Jeremiah prophesied, he said, I will give them a new law. I'll write my law, a new covenant. I will write my law on their hearts. I'll write my law on their hearts. Joel also prophesied a time when the gospel would go out to the Gentiles as well as the Jews. And this was the day, Pentecost. Because we know that on the day of Pentecost, the believers were meeting. I don't believe it was in the upper room at this time of meeting. They would have been meeting in the temple courts like everybody else. Quite likely Solomon's portico. That was a popular place for them to meet. And suddenly the Holy Spirit came on them and they spoke in what's called other tongues. And then the people all around, see, there were hundreds of them, thousands, people all around saying, hey, we can hear them speaking in our own language, but they're Galileans. How do they know our language? They don't. And they were speaking the things of God. They were preaching the gospel, basically. And then Peter stood up and said, you probably know this, they're not drunk, which is what some of you suggested. They can't, because it's only 9 o'clock in the morning. There's a book called 9 o'clock in the morning, very good. And he goes on to explain who Jesus was, that Jesus died for our sins, and so on. So that's a very exciting time. Now, what that means is that in the spring of that year, Jesus fulfilled the first 4 of the feasts or holy convocations. So in his first coming, Jesus fulfilled the first 4. Now, what about the last ones? There are 7, I said. And so we'll move on to them. Now, the last 3, they take place 6 months after Passover. So Passover started in the first month. The fifth one starts in the seventh month. Now you may know that as Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the year. Now what happened was that when the Israelites were in captivity, they went along with the Babylonian calendar. At least this is one understanding. I think it's probably most likely. And so they adopted the Babylonians' first day of the year, which was on the first of the seventh month. And when they came back, it's like they kept it. And even now, you will hear this feast day called Rosh Hashanah, which is the first day of the year. And they celebrate it a bit like we do New Year. Well, I don't, but some people do. They celebrate New Year. That's not in the Bible. And even Messianic Jews, I know, call it Rosh Hashanah. The correct name, as some of you will know, I expect you're telling me already, the correct name is, I'm just going to fold this over so that you see it better. It is Trumpets, the Feast of Trumpets, and it's Yom Teruah in Greek, right? So it's not Rosh Hashanah. You'll still hear it called Rosh Hashanah, but that's not it. Not in the Bible. Always go back to your Bible, that's what I say. So that's the first one, and that's on the first day of the seventh month. And all God said to do was blow trumpets and shout. Next one, Yom Kippur. Now you'll all have heard of this possibly, mainly I think because Jews take 1 or 2 days off school for Yom Kippur. We found this when I was teaching, that the sooner had you gone back to school in September than the Jewish colleagues were taking 1 or 2 days off for Yom Kippur. That's on the 10th day of the 7th month. And then finally, Tabernacles, which you've probably heard of as well, Sukkoth in Hebrew. And that was the 15th day and lasted for 8 days. So it's like 3/4 of the month. All in 1 month. So, have you got a note of those? Yom Teruah. Now, what does Yom Teruah celebrate? Now, the thing is that Jesus fulfilled the first 4, the spring feasts, in his first coming. And it is agreed by many people that the last 3 feasts or festivals, they refer to his second coming. And I'm going to stop shortly because this is, I wouldn't say contentious. There's lots of different beliefs about what the Feast of Trumpets means. Now, given the time we're in, all this COVID-19 thing, and the fact that it's leading to economic problems worldwide, there are many people now saying that this is the time when we could finish up with a one world government, and apparently there are groups of people who are pushing for this. If you want to find out more, go on the internet at your own risk. So what they're saying is this is the time when we are building up to the one world government and of course eventually the Antichrist. You may feel also that this latest agreement that Israel has made with the United Arab Emirates, which is the first agreement with any of the Arab states around Jerusalem, you may feel this is the beginning of the end. I was going to say it's the beginning of the treaties that Israel signs. I don't know. I'm open. I don't like to say no, this is just conspiracy theory, but I don't like to jump on board and say yes, this must be it. But certainly we are facing an economic crisis, and there are people who are talking about a global reset. Well, maybe. I don't know. But certainly I would think that the trumpets are sounding a warning. Now, the Israelites believed that that is a time of introspection, of preparing for the Day of Atonement, when judgment comes. So they repent of sin and do good deeds and give money away and so on. So they want to be in a place where their name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life, which you'll find reference to in Revelation. Of course, they don't accept the Book of Revelation, non-Messianic Jews. So it's certainly expected that there is talk of a Book of Life. I think it's in Daniel. So it's a time of preparation, and maybe actually the fulfillment of this is a preparation for Jesus' return, a time of getting right, of changing our lifestyle perhaps, making sure that we are living holy lives. And it's a time for sharing the gospel, saving people who are not saved. That's one explanation. There are lots of others. The trumpets in the Old Testament are used for various things, preparing for battle, preparing to move on. And the first place that the sound of a trumpet is heard is when God sounds it on Mount Sinai, and it terrified the people. Maybe it's to do with that. God saying, it's coming. Now, if you know anything about the end times, we're talking about a 7-year period where Israel sets up a treaty with the Antichrist, which all works well fine for 3.5 years, and then the Great Tribulation sets in. Now, there are different opinions about where we'll be. Some people say we will have been raptured by then. Others say, no, we will go through the Great Tribulation and will be raptured when Jesus comes back at the end of those last 3.5 years to defeat the Antichrist and the great army that is threatening to destroy Israel and, of course, Jerusalem in particular. Now, I've thrown in a few things there without real adequate explanation, but there you go. So we move on to the Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, which is seen, the fulfillment of this is seen as God's judgment time. So we need to know that we have the blood of the Lamb. It's seen as a national thing, and some believe, I think maybe I believe this, that is when when the Israelites will realise that Jesus is the Messiah. It says, can a nation be born in a day? Maybe that's it. I'm still open on these things, but I like to know what the options are, and I suppose I have a leaning towards one thing rather than another, but then the way I'm leaning today may be different from the way I'm leaning tomorrow. We then come on to the Feast of Tabernacles. And the Feast of Tabernacles is the greatest of the feasts, really, because it's a great celebration. It's a celebration of God going with his people, leading them through the wilderness. It's a reminder of how they lived in what are called tabernacles or booths. They lived in tents, and you will know perhaps that during this time, during this 8 days, that many Jews still celebrate it by living in a rather flimsy booth or tabernacle somehow attached to their home. It's not possible for all people, of course. If you're in a high-rise flat without a balcony, you probably can't do that. But many of them still do it, and they live in that. I don't know whether they sleep in it, I'm not sure. But certainly they do that. But the fulfillment of this is quite obviously Jesus living with his people on earth for 1,000 years. And then, when the new heaven and the new earth come, we will be with him forever. It's a joyous time, a great time. But just to get, and we're looking forward to that, sooner the better really, except I don't fancy the Great Tribulation myself. Just to say that the Yom Kippur is often known as the fast. The fast. It's a fasting day. And you may remember that Paul said he wouldn't set sail somewhere because it was after the fast. It's generally reckoned that after the fast, the Mediterranean Sea got a bit rough and it wasn't good to travel. As you read through the scriptures, the New Testament, read through the Gospels, read Acts, and you will find a remarkable number of references to the feasts. They're not called holy convocations there. They are called feasts or festivals, depending on your translation. And from that you can even work out how long Jesus' ministry was. Just for a bit of fun, I suppose. You often say he went up to Jerusalem for this and that. And his disciples encouraged him to go up, and he said, no, I'm not going, and then he did turn up. So there's a number of references to it. And so now I would say each time you come across a reference to a feast, perhaps you can work out which one it was if it doesn't say which one it was. There is an interesting little add-on here that there were some other feasts that were added over the years to celebrate some great events. Now, if I'd asked you which feasts you knew about, you'd probably say, oh, I know about Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights, which actually gained prominence in recent years. Hanukkah. Now, Hanukkah came years later, way after 400 BC. It came when the Maccabees managed to take back Jerusalem for a period of time, and they rededicated the temple. And you may know the story of they only had enough oil for the menorah to keep it alight for one day, and it lasted for 8 days. And so Hanukkah is a great celebration of that, and it's called the Festival of Lights for that very reason. We won't go into much detail, but it's also called the Feast of Dedication because that's when they rededicated the temple. You'll find in one of the Gospels a reference to the Feast of Dedication. So although it's not one of the 7, it was practiced by all Jews, as far as I can tell. The Feast of Dedication or Feast of Lights or Hanukkah. And I think you'll even find that Jesus went. Another one is Purim. You may know that celebrates the time when Esther became queen of Persia, and she went to see the king, who granted her an audience, and because of her, she could have been just sentenced to death just for going in without his permission. But she wasn't. He heard her. She explained that there was a plot to kill all the Jews throughout Persia, which was virtually the whole of the known land at the time. And that was a cunning plot by a man called Haman, and he had set up gallows to hang people. The king realised that Esther was right, and in the end Haman himself was hanged on his own gallows. But the great thing is that through Esther's bravery, the whole of Israel was saved. Genocide was avoided. And so that is celebrated as well. As I've already mentioned, Rosh Hashanah, which doesn't really exist. Now, if you want to know any more about these things in the end times, don't ask me because I'm a bit uncertain about what I think at the moment. But the books that are concerned with the end times really are Daniel, Zechariah, Matthew 24 and 25, Luke 21, and of course Revelation. And there are other places as well. There's I forgot to say 1 Thessalonians 4 and 2 Thessalonians, I can't remember which chapter. And of course, if you really want to find out, there's the internet. Oh, but beware. The internet is full of wrong teaching, muddled thinking, things which sound very good, but they haven't realised certain things are true. I would be very, very careful going on the internet. But, of course, on the internet there are some very good things. Okay, well, I hope you sort of followed what I've been talking about. Sorry about the lack of nice PowerPoint slides, which I set up and they seem to have a mind of their own. I'll see you next week, but I have a feeling that it may well be on Friday, not Thursday. We'll see. Goodbye for now. Have a great week. Bye.